The Virginia plan would become the House of Representatives.
And then I think it was how many people were in Senate? No, House of Representatives. I forgot the
Go
other.
ahead, Connor.
The Virginia plan put more power on the federal government, while the New Jersey plan put power more on the states.
That's fair. What about representation, though?
Well, Virginia, we basic population, while New Jersey, one state, one vote.
Equality, yeah. Virginia was going to be based on population. So the more people that you had, or in their plan, the more wealth that you had, the more representation you would have in the new Congress. So this is dealing specifically with the Constitution. And Melina, when you said that the Virginia plan became the House of Representatives, spot on. The United States Senate came from the New Jersey plan. In other words, each state would be represented equally. So one state would actually be 2 votes or 2 senators in today's context. So you go back and you look at this. Virginia was the big state plan. The more people you had, the more representation. The New Jersey was the small state plan. Every state, regardless of their size, would in fact be equal. And if you remember in this, the Connecticut Compromise, which actually is not up there, but the Connecticut or the Great Compromise was when they put these 2 together. So our system today is the House of Representatives, the Virginia plan, the Senate, the New Jersey plan. In order to get a bill passed, how do you have to get a bill passed? How do you get a bill to become a law?
You have to get it through both.
Through both how? Because I said something really specific. It's got to be passed in...
Both parts of the Senate and House, okay, pass them, and then you gotta get through 3/4 vote of the states.
It's got, oh no, you don't need any of the 3/4 of the states. We'll come back to the fractions. You need, no, let's see, we'll get into the fractions. There's none of that. You just need a simple majority in the House, simple majority in the Senate, but it's got to be passed in identical form in both. Because if it's not passed in identical form, then you don't have any agreement. And then, of course, it would go on to the president. So keep that in mind. Go ahead, Juan.
So the Connecticut Compromise, basically, they're just like, all right, let's
put them together. Yeah, so effectively, the big states didn't win and the small states didn't win. But the big states would have an advantage, and then they would have to overcome the House of Representatives. I'm sorry, the small states. The small states would have the advantage in the Senate, have to overcome the House of Representatives. The big states would have their advantage in the House of Representatives and have to overcome the Senate. Representation in Congress. Representation in Congress.
Was this this was after the Constitution?
This was, they were developing the Constitution, and this was the first big hurdle that they had to deal with, was big states versus small states. What else have y'all got in chapter 2? Go ahead, Keon. General fractions. Okay, general fractions. What are some of the fractions that we've talked about? Because there were a lot. I told you about this at the end of last week. Okay, what's the 3/5 clause?
Something about the slaves.
Something about the slaves. Can somebody give me a look? Go ahead, Melina.
I think 3 slaves were 1 vote, right?
No,
Everybody wants to say that. Go ahead, Yvette.
5 slaves are equal to 3 votes.
For population purpose. Now remember, the Virginia plan representation is based on population. So then the debate was, how do we count the slaves? And what they came up with was 5 slaves is equal to 3 people, or a slave is less than human, basically is what they're saying. So when it came to representation, the southern state slaves would count as 3/5 of a person when they figured out representation in Congress. They would have to pay taxes on these slaves 3/5 as well. So basically the northern states would get a little bit more in taxes. The southern states would get a little bit more in terms of representation. 3/5 is a good one. Other fractions. What was 2/3? What's that? How? Which part of the amendment to the Constitution? You're right, but which part? There's 2 parts. You got to propose it and you got to ratify it. 2/3 vote in order to propose a constitutional amendment. Martha, what did you just say? Yes, the veto override is also 2/3. What was the fraction that you needed in order to ratify a constitutional amendment? 3/4 of the states. What, we already dealt with 3/5. What was 9/13?
What was the 3/4? Sorry.
3/4 was ratifying a constitution. What was 9/13? Yeah, there's 2 on this.
Wasn't that back during the article?
It was back during the articles. What was that?
9 out of 13 colonies had to agree or had to come together.
To do what? Pass a law, exactly. What did they need if they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation?
Unanimous.
13 13ths. And then the other 9 13ths was Article 7 of the Constitution. You needed 9 of the 13 in order to ratify the Constitution. So keep that one in mind. Others up here. You good, Viv?
Schoolhouse Rock.
Schoolhouse Rock. Now, there was one that I showed you, and the Schoolhouse Rock was the one that was dealing with the Declaration of Independence. Make sure you have a sense of that. And we spent a few minutes on it, probably a multiple choice question, but that's really all that one was. And Schoolhouse Rock is posted in the videos in there. Any others?
18.
Go ahead, Gabe.
Preamble.
Don't worry about the preamble. I'll strike that one. I'll strike that one. Others?
So,
Yes.
just to reiterate, 9 out of 13 for Articles of Confederation to establish a law.
To pass a law,
Pass
yes.
a law, 13 out of 13 for an amendment.
It is, yes. Okay, any others? Go ahead. Go ahead.
1808.
What was 1808? Go ahead, Connor.
The end of the national slave trade.
End of the international slave trade. They basically gave the southern states from 1789 to 1808 so that they could trade in the international slave trade. And then after 1808, the international slave trade was going to go away. Their sense was that they wanted to end slavery, but if they took away the slaves, they'd be taking property, and they couldn't do that. We just fought a war. So they said, if we end the slave trade, then guess what? Then slavery will die a natural death because they're not going to be able to trade anymore. If you remember on this, it was the exact opposite. They accelerated slavery imports, and then the southern folks began to breed and trade slaves amongst themselves, and they didn't need the international slave trade. So there were 2 pieces right up here, 1808, and then the 3/5 clause that dealt with slavery. Do you remember what the third one was? Fugitive. Go ahead. Go ahead, Daniel.
It means that if a slave ran away from a state, the person in that state, the other state couldn't retrieve him if he could prove it.
Yeah, that's right. And do you remember what part of the Constitution that fell under?
It's like a driver's license.
It was like the driver's license. What part did the driver's license fall under? Full faith and credit clause. The fugitive slave law, the fugitive slave clause fell under full faith and credit. So basically, if you had documentation and you went into another state, that state would be required to recognize your documentation and return the slave back to you. So there was 1808, there was 3/5, and there was the fugitive slave clause. And if you remember, since we've got it here, full faith and credit, this actually is Article 4. Full faith and credit is Article 4. And if you remember, if you have a driver's license, that's a legally binding. If you have a valid driver's license, that's a legally binding document. Other states would have to recognize it if you're just passing through. You remember the other 2 examples that I had given you with full faith and credit? Go ahead.
Marriage.
Currency.
Marriage license. You don't have to get remarried if you go to another state because that's a binding document. Anything else?
Currency.
Not currency. Go ahead.
Warrants for arrest.
Warrants, yeah. If you had something outstanding in another state, and if you got caught in a different state, what would they do? They would transfer you back. What's the word for that? Extradite. You would be extradited back. What was Article 6? We just talked about it today. 2 parts of Article 6.
Religion.
No law can go over the Constitution.
Constitution is the supreme law of the land, or the supremacy clause, and if something does not jibe with the Constitution, it will be illegal. It'll be struck down. And somebody yelled out religion.
I do.
Go ahead. Well, wow, I really didn't think that was you. Go ahead. What do you mean religion?
I literally wrote down Article 6 religion.
Article 6. Go ahead, Austin.
It's that you don't have to have a religious oath to hold the government office.
Yeah, you are not required to take a religious oath or pass some form of religious test in order to hold office under the new government. This was the only example of religion in the original Constitution. That's all that was. Criminal searches. Go ahead.
What article is it?
Article 6.
That's religion.
That's religion. Religion and supremacy clause. What was Article 1?
Congress.
Congress. What was Article 2?
President.
President. What was Article 3?
Supreme Court.
Courts. Article 4. Full faith and credit. What was Article 5?
2/3.
2/3.
3/4.
Which deals with what?
Slavery.
No. Amending the Constitution. Article 6 was dealing with supremacy clause and religion, and then Article 7 was ratification, and that was the 9/13. So there's some good questions for articles that could come from this, but just multiple choices. There are some good questions that could come from fractions. Again, just more than likely multiple choices. We talked about a few criminal searches, I think. Can you think of any? Stop and frisk is actually pretty good. That actually is. What is stop and frisk?
Basically, if you have suspicious odor.
If you have a suspicious odor?
No.
What did you...
Oh, like if you're suspicious of somebody, you get to stop and search them.
Okay, where was stop and frisk? New York City. In New York City, if the NYPD viewed you somehow as active furtively or suspiciously, then in fact they could come up and they could stop and frisk you even without a warrant, and they could take things that in fact you weren't legally supposed to be carrying around. What was the problem with this?
I think it was because the African Americans were, well, I wouldn't say targeted more, but they were stopped more, I guess.
Let me stress something because I see a couple of puzzled looks. The 11 o'clock class does not have stop and frisk. So let me go ahead and make sure that I'm clear on this. They targeted African Americans and who?
Hispanics.
And Hispanics. Everybody remember the numbers? There aren't very many numbers on this exam, but this is a good one. Do you remember the numbers?
Yeah, they said that 75 to 80% of them were
Them!
were blacks and Hispanics.
75 to 80, is that the right number?
No.
50% of
I think it's 80.
I think it was about 87% of the population. In other words, they stopped about, what, 4.4 million people. Let me go ahead and pull this up just to make sure that we get this right. They stopped about 4.4 million people, and then roughly a little bit less than 4 million of them, in fact, were either black or Hispanic. And I think it says in the article that the population is nowhere close to 87% black and Hispanic in New York. So it seems like that there was kind of a little bit of a disproportion there. And I'll go ahead and I'll give you this. Yeah, it says 87% of 4.4 million people were stopped. Ultimately, 90% of them were released without any charges. However, it goes down here and it says, in New York City, blacks commit 66% of the city's violent crimes and 77% of the shootings. So you could argue that maybe they were targeting where the crime was happening, or you could argue, in fact, that maybe, guess what, this is really, really discrimination. Do you remember how many guns and weapons they seized in that 10-year period? 8,000 guns, and I heard somebody say 80,000.
Nice.
80,000 knives, box cutters, and other things. Yeah, I think it was you that said it. See, I was trying to give you props. So that means basically that every hour of every day of every week of every month of every year for a decade, they were able to pull a weapon off the street. And you could argue that this actually made things safer. However, you could also argue that this was complete discrimination because it was so disproportionate toward black and Hispanic and not other New Yorkers. Is it legal? It is absolutely legal. Yes, it is. And what they're doing is they're requiring body cameras. They're looking at the footage so that they can figure out what it is that made people look suspicious. And if it is based on race, they're probably going to strike it down, but they haven't yet. Do you remember who was most likely to be the victim if the weapon stayed on the streets? The same people that were actually getting their rights violated. In other words, by taking these weapons from black and Hispanic New Yorkers, you're probably saving other black and Hispanic New Yorkers from having crimes committed against them. So some people actually argued that maybe this wasn't discriminatory at all. Make sure that you're comfortable with the facts on these. And tell me the story, you know? Tell me the story. I mean, lay it out to me. Hey, this is argued legal because this is not legal. And then this is the one article that's really got some numbers in it. So make sure that you're good with those. Looking at just anything else from chapter 2 jump out?
Are you done?
Check
Talk
the balance.
about Bills of Rights?
Say what?
Are you done? I was talking about
What is the Bill of Rights? First 10 amendments to the Constitution. I think that's probably good for this one. I think that's probably good. You want to tell me more? I mean, if you want to tell me more, we can put it on tape right now. Go ahead, Viv. In the beginning, and we actually just went over this today. with chapter 3. In the beginning, what was the power ratio in the government?
More state and less.
More state and far less federal for about the first third of the country. From the Civil War until FDR, it was roughly about 50-50. And then in the last third of the country, more federal and less state is basically what we're talking on that. So kind of keep those pieces in mind. We talked about dual federalism. We talked about devolution, revolution. Don't worry about full faith and credit. Oh, actually, no, you do have to worry about that one. Don't worry about commerce, tax and spend, and privileges and immunities. And don't worry about ideology. So you don't have to worry about the bottom 7 terms on this. It stops at full faith and credit. Go ahead.
Will you be asking questions based on statistics on the articles?
If there are statistics there, and there's really only one that had them.
Okay.
Yeah, and we've talked about that. But let's talk about the articles, because this is going to be a big part of this. Let me go back to chapter 1, and we'll hit a few of these, and we'll make sure that y'all are good. Looking at chapter 1, are y'all good with the Catholic school teacher?
Yeah.
Okay, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to take a look at the video. I like using videos, just a hint. But remember, with the Catholic school teacher, tell me the story about Michelle McCusker. What was the ultimate outcome? Let me ask you that.
She was fired.
She was fired. There were 2 reasons why she was fired. What were the 2 reasons?
Signed a contract.
She was unwed, pregnant, and what'd you say over here?
She signed a contract.
And she signed a contract and
broke.
And she broke the contract by being unwed and pregnant. So part of this was contract law. What was the second reason why she was fired?
Because she actually went up and she told him.
She did tell on herself, but there's what did they say? What was her argument why she shouldn't be fired?
She didn't want to get married.
Her
There's another guy doing
also-
the same. Not married.
The other sex, the male co-worker.
Male co-workers, male teachers, male people working at the Catholic school were having sex out of wedlock, and she was being discriminated against because their bodies wouldn't tell on them, but her body